the autumn of 1890, the small village of Thornwick, nestled in the fog-choked hills of rural England, was a place where time seemed to stand still. The nearest town was a day's ride away, and the villagers liked it that way. Thornwick was a cluster of stone cottages, a single church with a sagging steeple, and fields that stretched toward the horizon, interrupted only by the dense, shadowed expanse of blackthorn wood. At the edge of this wood ran a narrow, winding road known to locals as the Hollowridge Path, that led to the crumbling gates of Hollowridge Manor. The manor had been abandoned for decades, its windows dark, its walls overtaken by ivy that seemed to pulse with a life of its own. But it wasn't the manor itself that kept the villagers awake at night. It was the road. The Hollowridge Path was not a road one took lightly. It was a mile-long stretch of packed earth, flanked by gnarled oaks whose branches twisted into shapes that seemed to shift when you weren't looking. The locals avoided it, especially after dusk, when the fog would settle so thickly that even a lantern's glow could barely pierce it. They spoke of the road in hushed tones, as if naming it too loudly might summon something from the shadows. The story, passed down through generations, began with Reverend Thomas Eldridge, a man revered in Thornwick for his piety and wisdom. In 1890, Eldridge was 52, a widower with no children, known for his sermons that blended fire and brimstone, fervor with an almost scholarly curiosity about the natural world. He was a man of science as much as faith, often seen collecting herbs or sketching the strange fungi that grew in blackthorn wood. But in the spring of that year, something changed. It started with whispers. Villagers noticed Eldridge walking the Hollowridge Path more often, always alone, always at twilight. He'd return with a distant look in his eyes, his hands stained with soil or something darker, though no one dared ask what. By summer, his sermons grew strange. He spoke less of salvation and more of the will of the earth, of a divine force that spoke through root and stone. His voice, once steady, now trembled with a fervor that felt both ecstatic and unhinged. The congregation dwindled, but those who stayed reported an eerie intensity in his gaze, a faint, unnatural glow in his eyes, like the flicker of a candle. Behind smoked glass dot by autumn, Eldridge was rarely seen in the village. He'd taken to living in a small cottage near the Hollowridge Path, closer to the manor than anyone thought wise. The few who visited him mostly out of duty returned with troubling stories. Mary Cutler, a seamstress, swore she saw Eldridge standing motionless in his garden at midnight, his head tilted skyward, his arms outstretched as if embracing the stars. She claimed his shadow moved before he did, stretching toward the road like a living thing. John Harrow, the village blacksmith, said he'd heard Eldridge muttering in a language that sounded like no tongue he knew, the words sharp and gut, as if torn from the earth itself. The first real sign of something wrong came in September, when a boy named Samuel Pike went missing. Samuel, barely 14, was a quiet lad who helped his father tend sheep. He'd been seen walking near the Hollowridge Path, chasing a stray lamb just before dusk. A search party scoured the fields and woods, but no trace of him was found, not his body, not his clothes, not even the lamb. The villagers whispered that the road had taken him, though none could say what that meant. Eldridge, when questioned, offered no answers. He stood at the edge of the path, his eyes fixed on the manor in the distance, and said only, "The road gives and the road takes. It is not for us to question." By October, the village was gripped by a quiet dread. The Hollowridge Path seemed to hum with a life of its own. Travelers passing through Thornwick, as they spoke of hearing footsteps behind them on the road, though no one was there. Others claimed the oaks along the path swayed on windless nights, their branches forming shapes that looked like doorways or hands. A farmer named Eliza Wren swore she saw a figure standing at the manor's gates one evening, tall and impossibly thin, its limbs bending at angles that made her stomach churn. When she blinked, it was gone. The village doctor, a pragmatic man named Dr. William Voss, began to suspect Eldridge was at the heart of it all. Voss was no stranger to the ailments of rural life, fevers, infections, the occasional madness brought on by isolation, but what he saw in Eldridge defied explanation. He visited the Reverend in late October, hoping to diagnose what he assumed was a mental collapse. What he found instead was a man transformed. Eldridge's skin was pale, almost translucent, with veins that seemed to pulse with a faint greenish light. His movements were too precise, too fluid, as if his joints obeyed some unseen rhythm. And his eyes, Voss wrote in his journal, that they glowed with a fire not of this world, as if something ancient looked out through them. Voss's journal, preserved in the county archives, is one of the few primary sources from that time. His entries grow increasingly erratic, filled with sketches of impossible shape spirals that seemed to twist inward forever. Angles that couldn't exist in 3 dimensions. He wrote of examining Eldridge's cottage and finding strange markings carved into the floorboards. Symbols that hurt his eyes to look at. He noted, too, a peculiar smell like damp earth mixed with something metallic, almost like blood, but sharper. Voss began to suspect that Eldridge was not ill, but changed, transformed by something he'd encountered on the Hollowridge path. The villagers, meanwhile, were falling ill. It started with a handful of cases, a fever that wouldn't break, a rash that spread in patterns like roots across the skin. Those afflicted spoke of dreams where they walked the Hollowridge path, drawn toward the manor by a voice that wasn't a voice, but a vibration in their bones. Some recovered, but others didn't. A woman named Margaret Hale, a mother of 3, was found one morning in her bed, her body stiff, her eyes wide open, her skin covered in a fine layer of moss-like growth. The village undertaker refused to touch her, claiming her body felt wrong, as if it were heavier than it should have been, as if something else was inside her. By November, Thornwick was a village on the edge of collapse. The church stood empty, its pews gathering dust. The Hollowridge path was avoided entirely, though some claimed they could hear it calling a low, resonant hum that seemed to come from the ground itself. Voss, now obsessed, began walking the path himself, determined to uncover its secrets. His journal entries from this time are fragmented, filled with references to the geometry of the divine and a truth too vast for human minds. He wrote of seeing Eldridge at the manor one night, standing in the courtyard, surrounded by figures that weren't human shapes that flickered like shadows but moved with purpose, their limbs bending in ways that defied biology. Voss's final entry, dated November 12, 1890, is chilling in its brevity. The road is alive. It sees us. It knows our names. I cannot stop walking. Asterisk, asterisk, the winter of 1890 descended on Thornwick like a shroud. The village, already gripped by fear, seemed to shrink under the weight of the season's early frosts. The fields lay barren. The livestock grew gaunt, and the air carried a chill that felt less like weather and more like a presence. The Hollowridge path, now avoided by all but the desperate or the mad, became a specter in the villagers' minds. Its name was spoken only in whispers, and even then, only by those brave or foolish enough to tempt fate. The road to Hollowridge Manor had become more than a path. It was a wound in the earth, festering with something no one could name. Dr. William Voss's disappearance marked a turning point. After his final journal entry on November 12th, he was seen once more, stumbling through the village square at dawn, his coat torn, his face gaunt and streaked with dirt. His eyes, once sharp with the clarity of a man of science, were wild, darting as if tracking something invisible. When a farmer tried to speak to him, Voss muttered only, "It's in the angles. The angles don't align." He was last seen walking toward the Hollowridge path, a lantern swinging in his hand, its light swallowed by the fog before he reached the first oak. No one followed him. No one dared. The village turned inward, barricading itself against the unknown. Doors were bolted, windows shuttered, and children were forbidden from straying near Blackthorn Wood. Yet the strange illness that had begun in autumn spread unchecked. It was no longer confined to a few. By December, nearly a quarter of Thornwick's 200 souls showed symptoms. Fevers that burned without heat, rashes that traced fractal-like patterns across the skin, and dreams so vivid they left people weeping or screaming upon waking. The afflicted spoke of the same vision, a path that stretched endlessly, flanked by trees that whispered their names, leading to a manor where something vast and unseen waited. Some claimed they saw figures in their dreams, tall and impossibly thin, with eyes that glowed like embers in the dark. The village's remaining elders, led by Agnes Poole, a stern widow who ran the local apothecary, tried to make sense of the chaos. Agnes was a woman of practical faith, distrustful of both superstition and blind piety, but even she could not deny the unnatural air that clung to them. She pored over Voss's journal, which had been found abandoned in the church, its pages filled with sketches of spirals, stars, and shapes that seemed to writhe on the paper. One entry, dated just before his disappearance, described a visit to Reverend Eldridge's cottage. Voss had found the Reverend kneeling in his garden, his hands buried in the soil, his lips moving as if in prayer. When Voss approached, Eldridge turned, and for a moment his face seemed to shift, his features blurring, as if his skin were a mask slipping over something else. Voss wrote, his eyes were not his own. There were too many, too deep, like wells into something I cannot name. Agnes, though shaken, refused to believe in the supernatural. She consulted old medical texts, searching for a rational explanation of fungal infection, perhaps carried by the damp air of blackthorn wood, or a contagion brought by travelers. But the symptoms defied her knowledge. The rashes, when examined closely, formed patterns that resembled no known disease. They curled and branched like the roots of a tree, glowing faintly in the dark, as if lit from within. The afflicted grew, stronger, not weaker, their movements unnaturally precise, their senses sharpened to an eerie degree. A boy named Thomas Reed, barely 10, was seen lifting a cartwheel with one hand, his eyes glowing faintly as he stared into the distance. His mother swore he spoke in his sleep, reciting numbers, coordinates, perhaps, or something strange in a voice that wasn't his. The church, once a place of solace, became a source of dread. Eldridge had not been seen in weeks, but his presence lingered. Villagers reported hearing his voice in the wind, a low chant that seemed to come from the direction of the Hollowridge path. The church's stained glass windows, depicting saints and angels, began to warp. The colors bled, the figures twisted into shapes that hurt to look at, his too long limbs, too long, faces that seemed to watch the congregation. One night, a farmer named Henry Gale broke into the church, claiming he'd seen the windows move. He was found the next morning, curled up in the pews, his hands clawing at his face, muttering about the geometry of God. By January, the village was fracturing. Families turned on one another, accusing neighbors of witchcraft or collusion with whatever haunted the path. Some packed their belongings and fled, only to return days later, pale and trembling, claiming the road had called them back. Others vanished entirely, their homes left empty, their footprints leading to the edge of the Hollowridge path and stopping abruptly, as if they'd been lifted into the air. The manor itself, visible only as a dark silhouette through the fog, became an obsession. Those who dared approach it spoke of a hum emanating from its walls, a vibration that made their teeth ache and their thoughts scatter. One man, a traveling merchant named Edward Klein, claimed he'd seen lights flickering in the manor's windows, greenish orbs that pulsed in time with his heartbeat. Agnes Poole, desperate for answers, organized a small group to investigate the manor. She chose 3 men: Peter Dunn, a burly farmer with a reputation for courage; Elias Holt, a former soldier who'd seen enough horrors to doubt any god; and herself, armed with Voss's journal and a dwindling hope for a rational explanation. They set out at dawn, their lanterns casting weak beams against the fog. The Hollowridge path seemed to resist their presence. The air grew thick, the ground soft and grasping, as if reluctant to let them pass. The oaks loomed larger than they should have, their branches forming arches that seemed to shift and close behind them. Peter swore he saw faces in the bark, human faces, frozen in silent screams. Halfway down the path, they found something that stopped them cold. A tree, larger than the others, stood at an angle that defied logic, its trunk bending as if bowing to the manor. Its roots were exposed, twisting upward like fingers clawing at the sky. Embedded in the bark was a piece of cloth, a shred of Samuel Pike's jacket, the boy who'd vanished months before. The cloth was pristine, untouched by weather, as if it had been placed there moments ago. Elias, his voice shaking, pointed out something else. The roots of the tree were pulsing, not with sap, but with something darker, something that glistened like oil, but moved like blood. Agnes, clutching Voss's journal, read aloud a passage she'd overlooked. The road is a vein, and the manor is its heart. Something flows through it, something old, something that was here before us, and will be hereafter. The words felt heavy, as if speaking them gave them power. The group pressed on, driven by a mix of fear and compulsion, but the manor seemed no closer. The path stretched, the fog thickened, and the hum grew louder, vibrating in their chests. Peter began to weep, though he couldn't say why. Elias, the soldier, drew his knife, muttering about cutting the heart out of it, though he wouldn't say what it was. When they finally reached the manor's gates, they found them open, the iron rusted, but oddly warm to the touch. The courtyard was empty, save for a single figure standing at its center, Reverend Eldridge, or what was left of him. His body was too tall, too thin, his limbs bending at angles that made Agnes's stomach lurch. His skin was translucent, veins glowing faintly beneath it, and his eyes, those terrible eyes, burned with a light that seemed to pull at the edges of their minds. He didn't speak, but his presence was a command, a summons to step closer, to see what he saw. Agnes, trembling, opened Voss's journal one last time. The final page was a drawing, a spiral that seemed to twist inward, pulling her gaze into its center. Beneath it, in Voss's shaking hand, were the words, "It is not God, it is older, it is hungrier." The fog around Hollowridge Manor seemed to breathe, curling around Agnes Poole and her companions like a living thing, as they stood frozen at the gates. The air was thick with the smell of damp earth and that sharp, metallic tang that had haunted Dr. Voss's journal. Reverend Eldridge, the thing that wore his form, stood motionless in the courtyard, his glowing eyes fixed on them. His silhouette was wrong, elongated, as if stretched by some unseen force, his limbs bending in ways that suggested joints where none should be. The hum that had plagued Thornwick for months was deafening here, a low, resonant pulse that seemed to come from the ground, the walls, the very air itself. It vibrated in their bones, urging them forward. Even as every instinct screamed to run. Agnes clutched Voss's journal, its pages now feeling heavier, as if the ink itself carried a weight. Peter Dunn, the farmer, was trembling, his lantern shaking in his hand, casting jagged shadows that seemed to rise independently of the light. Elias Holt, the former soldier, gripped his knife so tightly his knuckles whitened, his eyes darting between Eldridge and the manor's dark windows. The building loomed behind the Reverend, its stone walls glistening as if slick with moisture, though no rain had fallen. The ivy that clung to it moved subtly, its tendrils curling and uncurling like fingers testing the air. "We should go back," Peter whispered, his voice barely audible over the hum. "This ain't right. He ain't right." Elias spat on the ground, his bravado faltering. "He's just a man. Sick, maybe. Mad, sure, but a man." Agnes didn't respond. She couldn't tear her eyes from Eldridge. His head tilted slightly, as if listening to something they couldn't hear. And for a moment, his face seemed to flicker, his features dissolving into a blur of shadow, before snapping back into place. The sight sent a chill through her, not just of fear, but of something deeper, something existential. It was as if the rules of the world's rules she'd built her life upon were unraveling before her. "Reverend Eldridge," she called, her voice steadier than she felt. "What's happened to you? What's happened to Thornwick?" Eldridge's lips parted, but the sound that came wasn't a voice. It was a low, guttural drone, layered with tones that seemed to harmonize and clash at once, like a choir of discordant whispers. The words, if they could be called that, were unintelligible, yet they carried a weight that pressed against Agnes's mind, filling it with images, endless roots twisting through the earth, stars that pulsed like hearts, a vast, formless presence that watched from beyond the sky. She staggered, clutching her head, and saw Peter drop to his knees, his lantern shattering on the cobblestones. Elias lunged forward, knife raised, but before he could reach Eldridge, the ground shifted. The cobblestones cracked, roots black and glistening, bursting upward, coiling around Elias's legs. He screamed, slashing at them, but the roots moved with unnatural coordination, tightening like a predator's grip. Agnes grabbed Peter, pulling him back toward the gates, but the hum grew louder, drowning out Ilias's cries. She turned to see him being dragged downward, the roots pulling him into the earth, his body folding in ways that made her stomach churn. Within moments, he was gone, the ground sealing over as if nothing had happened. Eldridge hadn't moved. His eyes burned brighter now, and Agnes could swear she saw shapes within them. Spirals, angles, forms that twisted her perception. She wanted to run, but her legs felt rooted, as if the path itself held her in place. Peter was sobbing, muttering prayers, but the words seemed to dissolve in the air, swallowed by the hum. "We need to know," Agnes said, more to herself than to Peter. She opened Voss's journal, her hand shaking, and read the last coherent entry aloud. "The manor is not a place. It is a door. The road is its key." Eldridge opened it, and something came through. "It is not God. It is not the devil. It is something else." The words seemed to provoke a response. The manor's windows flared with that same greenish light, pulsing in time with the hum. The ivy on the walls writhed faster, forming patterns that looked like eyes, mouths, hands. Eldridge took a step forward, his movements too smooth, too precise, like a marionette guided by invisible strings. Agnes's heart pounded, but she forced herself to stand her ground. She had to understand. She had to know what Voss had seen, what Eldridge had become. "Show me," she said, her voice trembling but resolute. "Show me what you found." Eldridge's head tilted further, an impossible angle, and for a moment his face was no longer his own. It was Samuel Pike's, the missing boy, then Margaret Hale's, then others villagers who'd vanished or died, their features flickering across his skin like reflections in a broken mirror. The hum became a voice, not spoken but felt, a command that burrowed into Agnes's mind. "Come, see." The gates behind them slammed shut, though no one touched them. The path seemed to stretch, the manor growing larger, its walls bending inward, as if inviting them inside. Peter screamed, scrambling to his feet, but the roots were there again, coiling around his ankles, his wrists, his throat. Agnes tried to pull him free, but the roots were too strong, their surface slick and warm, pulsing with that same dark liquid she'd seen in the tree. Peter's screams faded as he was dragged into the earth, his body folding, twisting, becoming something else. Agnes was alone now, the journal slipping from her hands. Eldridge, or whatever he was, extended a hand, his fingers too long, too many, curling in a gesture that was both invitation and command. The hum was inside her now, vibrating in her chest, her skull, her soul. She took a step forward, then another, drawn toward the manor's doors. They opened before she reached them, revealing a darkness that wasn't empty, a darkness that moved, that watched inside. The manor was not what it seemed. The walls were alive, pulsing with the same greenish light, covered in patterns that shifted and spiraled, defying geometry. The air was thick, heavy with that metallic scent, and the floor felt soft, almost organic, as if she were walking on flesh. She saw shapes in the shadows, figures that were not human, their limbs bending at impossible angles, their eyes glowing with that same terrible light. They moved with a grace that was both beautiful and horrifying, their bodies flowing like liquid, reforming into shapes that made her mind recoil doubt. At the center of the manor was a chamber, its ceiling lost in darkness, its walls lined with roots that pulsed and writhed. In the middle stood a tree, not a tree, but something that mimicked one, its branches reaching upward, outward, into dimensions Agnes couldn't comprehend. At its base was Eldridge, or what had been Eldridge, his body, half merged with the tree, his skin blending into bark, his veins into roots. His eyes met hers, and she felt a pull, a promise of knowledge, of transformation, of becoming something more. "You see now," the thing that was Eldridge said, its voice a chorus of whispers. "The road led you here. It always would." Agnes's vision blurred, her thoughts fragmented. She saw flashes of the village Thornwick burning, its people changed, their bodies moving with that same unnatural grace. their eyes glowing. She saw Voss, his body twisted, his face serene, as if he'd found peace and surrender. She saw the path, stretching not just through blackthorn wood, but through time, through worlds, a vein connecting this place to something vast, something hungry. She stumbled back, her mind screaming against the truth. The hum was louder now, a song that promised everything and nothing. She felt her skin prickle, her veins pulse, as if something were trying to take root inside her. She turned to run, but the manor's doors were gone, the walls closing in, the roots reaching for her. Agnes Poole's mind clawed at the edges of itself, desperate to hold on to reason as the chamber within Hollowridge Manor pulsed around her. The air was thick, suffocating, laced with that metallic temps, now so strong it coated her tongue like blood. The tree-like entity at the room's center loomed larger, its branches, or whatever they were, stretching into the darkness above, twisting into shapes that seemed to fold into themselves, defying the laws of space. Reverend Eldridge, or the thing that had once been him, was no longer distinguishable from the tree. His form had melted into it, his skin blending seamlessly into bark, his limbs woven into roots that pulsed with that dark, oily liquid. His eyes, still glowing with that sickly green light, held her gaze, and within them, she saw not just Eldridge, but countless others, faces of the lost, the transformed, the consumed. The hum was deafening now, a vibration that shook her bones and blurred her thoughts. It wasn't just sound, it was a presence, a will, urging her to step closer, to touch the tree, to surrender. Her body moved without her consent, her feet dragging across the soft, fleshy floor, each step pulling her deeper into the chamber. The walls seemed to breathe, their surfaces rippling with patterns that looked like veins, like eyes, like mouths, whispering her name. She wanted to scream, but her voice felt trapped, smothered by the weight of the air. "Join us," the chorus of whispers said, emanating from Eldridge, from the tree, from the manor itself. "See what we see, know what we know." Agnes's hand reached out, trembling, drawn to the tree's surface. It was warm, alive, its bark pulsing under her fingertips. The moment she touched it, her mind flooded with visions, fractured, overwhelming. She saw Thornwick as it had been centuries before. A circle of standing stones where the manor now stood, figures in robes chanting under a sky that burned with unnatural stars. She saw the Hollowridge path, not as a road, but as a scar, a channel, carved by something older than the earth itself, something that had waited, patient and ravenous, for someone to open the way. She saw Eldridge, walking the path night after night, his curiosity turning to obsession, his body a vessel for something that poured through him, reshaping him into its image. The visions shifted, showing her the villagers Samuel, Pike, Margaret, Hale, Dr. Voss, and others, each drawn to the path, each changed. Their bodies were no longer human, their limbs elongated, their movements fluid and precise, their eyes glowing with that same terrible light. They were not dead, but they were not alive in any way Agnes could understand. They were part of something larger, something that stretched beyond the manor, beyond Thornwick, beyond the world itself, and they were calling her to join them. Her skin burned where she touched the tree, and she yanked her hand back, gasping. The roots beneath her feet stirred, coiling toward her like snakes, their tips glistening with that dark liquid. She stumbled backward, her mind reeling, but the chamber seemed to shift, the walls closing in, the tree growing larger, its branches reaching for her. She saw her reflection in the glistening surface of a root, not her face, but something else, something with too many eyes, too many limbs, a mockery of her form that smiled with a mouth that wasn't hers. "No," she whispered, the word "a," desperate anchor to her humanity. She turned, searching for an exit, but the doors were gone, replaced by a seamless expanse of pulsing wall. The hum grew louder, more insistent, and she felt it inside her now, a rhythm that matched her heartbeat, urging it to change, to align with something else. Her veins itched, her skin prickled, and when she looked at her hands, she saw faint lines forming root-like patterns, glowing faintly, spreading from her fingertips. She ran, though she didn't know where. The chamber seemed to stretch, its geometry twisting, corridors appearing where none had been, leading her deeper into the manor. She passed rooms filled with impossible sights, a mirror that showed not her reflection, but a sky filled with spiraling stars, a floor that rippled like water, with shapes moving beneath it, a wall carved with symbols that shifted when she tried to read them, burning her eyes with their complexity. The air grew heavier, the hum more oppressive, and she felt her thoughts fraying. Her sense of self slipping. In one room, she found Dr. Vossor. What was left of him? He stood motionless, his body half merged with the wall, his skin translucent, his veins glowing with that same greenish light. His head turned slowly, his eyes meeting hers, and for a moment she saw recognition, then sorrow, then nothing. "It's beautiful," he whispered, his voice a hollow echo. "It's everything." His body shuddered, then dissolved, sinking into the wall like water into sand, leaving only a faint glow behind. Agnes kept running, her breath ragged, her mind a storm of fear and fascination. The manor was alive. She realized not a building, but an organism, a vessel for something that had waited eons to be found. The Hollowridge path was its artery, the villagers its blood, and she was being drawn into its heart. She saw flashes of Eldridge's sermons, his talk of the will of the earth, and understood now that he hadn't been speaking metaphorically. Something had spoken to him, through the path, through the manor, and he had listened. He had opened the door. She stumbled into another chamber, larger than the last, its ceiling a dome of writhing roots that pulsed with light. At its center was the tree again, or another tree. She couldn't tell. It was larger, its branches stretching into dimensions she couldn't comprehend, its roots burrowing into the floor, the walls, the air itself. Figures stood around it, not human, not anymore, but shapes that mimicked humanity. Their bodies fluid, their eyes glowing, their movements synchronized in a way that made her skin crawl. She recognized some of them: Samuel, Margaret, Peter, Elias, each transformed, each part of the whole. "You cannot leave," the chorus said, their voices blending into one. "The road brought you. The road keeps you." Agnes fell to her knees, her hands clawing at the floor, which gave way like flesh. The roots were on her now, wrapping around her wrists, her ankles, gentle but unyielding. She felt them pierce her skin, not with pain, but with a warmth that was almost comforting, almost inviting. Her vision blurred, her thoughts scattered, and she saw the truth, not a truth she could articulate, but one she felt in her soul. The manor, the path, the trees, they were part of something vast, something that had always been here, waiting for someone to walk the path, to open the door. To let it in, she fought, though she didn't know why. Her hands tore at the roots, her nails breaking, her blood mixing with the dark liquid that flowed from them. She screamed, but the sound was swallowed by the hum, which was now a song, a hymn to something older than God, hungrier than the devil. She saw her life, her apothecary, her village, her faith dissolving like ash in the wind, replaced by something else, something infinite. And then, silence. The roots released her, the hum faded, and she was alone in the chamber. The tree was gone, the figures were gone. The manor was just a manor again, crumbling stone, broken windows, dust. She staggered to her feet, her body trembling, her skin marked with faint root-like patterns that no longer glowed. She found a door, stumbled through it, and emerged into the courtyard, the fog thinning, the manor silent behind her. The Hollowridge path stretched before her, unchanged, its oak still, twisting, its air still heavy. She walked, not knowing why, her steps unsteady but drawn forward. When she reached Thornwick, the village was empty. No lights burned in the cottages. No voices called out. The church was a ruin, its windows shattered, its pews overturned. The villagers were gaunt, taken, transformed, or something worse. She couldn't say. Agnes left Thornwick that night, carrying only Voss's journal, its pages now blank except for a single spiral, drawn in her own hand. She never spoke of what she saw, but those who met her in the years that followed, travelers, scholars, priests, noticed the way her eyes seemed to glow faintly in the dark, the way her movements were too precise, too fluid. She never returned to Thornwick, but she carried the Hollowridge path with her, in her dreams, in her veins. The manor still stands, or so the stories say, Hidden in the fog of Blackthorn Wood, the path still calls. Its hum faint but persistent, waiting for someone new to walk its length. Have you heard of it? Would you walk it, knowing what you know?